Blind Trust by Vamek Volkan, large groups and their leaders in times of crisis and terror. This is very interesting. I want to understand what is happening to America right now. And I think this is one of the good representations of what is going on. So here it talks about large group psychology, psychology of religious fundamentalism, leadership and personality, and there's a case study, I guess. So let's begin. Introduction. When Einstein wrote to ask him what he thought science might do for world peace, Freud wrote back, "Not much," and took the occasion to point out that science too begins and ends in myth. Howard Nemerov, Einstein, Freud, and Jack. The terrorist acts of September 11, 2001 were brutally inhumane, but the people who planned and carried out those acts were not inhuman. Their personal motivations, about which we know very little, for bringing about such monumental devastation were entwined with the more well-known and articulated motivations of the large groups to which they belonged, Al-Qaeda. The events and consequences of September 11, including the tendency of the United States to divide the world into those who are with us and those who are against us, have sharpened the need to further understand human nature, especially the relationships between individuals and their large groups, and those between large groups themselves. This book is not about September 11 or terrorism or more recent events in Afghanistan and Iraq per se. Rather, it examines how certain universal elements of human nature converge to create an atmosphere that both gives rise to violent, aggressive acts, such as the September 11 attacks or war, and allows the smothering of individuals' rights and freedoms, such as by a repressive totalitarian regime, or even more subtly by a democratic states preoccupied with national security concerns. This book focuses on large group identity, how societies under threat are subject to a large group of aggression, and how political leaders may manipulate this regression. Okay. The concept of large group identity describes how thousands or millions of individuals, most of whom will never meet in their lifetimes, are bound by an intense sense of sameness by belonging to the same ethnic, religious, national, or ideological group. Interestingly, large group identity is not something on which we consciously focus in our routine everyday lives. We do not wake up in the morning feeling intensely Egyptian, Vietnamese, or American. Belonging to a large group does not necessarily come to our minds while walking or driving to work, even though we may see symbols of that group identity, such as a flag, during the journey. Our relationship with our large group identity in ordinary times is like breathing. We breathe constantly and we are unaware of it unless someone reminds us of the fact that we need air to survive. Consider having pneumonia or being in a smoke-filled building. In those circumstances, we do not need to have our need for breath brought to our attention. We are instantly aware of every breath we take. If our large group identity is under attack, we behave like an individual with pneumonia or in a burning building. We are acutely aware of our large group affiliation, its perceived characteristics, our emotional investment in it, and how we are similar to thousands or millions of others who also belong to the large group. At the same time, we separate ourselves from those we consider to be different from us. Under such circumstances, we see how our individual sense of self our personal identity becomes entwined with our large group identity. We may even experience that being Egyptian, Vietnamese, or American may be more important than being Abdullah, Phuong, or Stephanie. Okay, interesting. I guess that's true. I would agree with that. Threats to the abstract psychological creation, that is, large group identity, produce shared anxiety, and this may lead to a societal regression among the members of the large group. In general terms, regression in an individual involves a return to some of the psychological expectations, wishes, fears, and associated mental defense mechanisms of an earlier stage of human development. For example, for many weeks after the September 11 attacks, Beth, an American woman living in Virginia, found herself eating only macaroni and cheese. Her eating behavior represented a personal regression. When Beth was a child, her mother used to feed her macaroni and cheese whenever Beth felt anxious. Beth's mother, who lived in New York City, was not directly hurt on September 11. Beth knew intellectually that her mother had survived the World Trade Center attack, but she unconsciously feared that her mother had died or had come close to death. By regressing and eating only macaroni and cheese, she utilized a mental mechanism that kept her mother alive. Some weeks later, her mother came to visit, and after actually seeing her, Beth gave up obsessively eating macaroni and cheese. She now knew that her mother was alive. Okay, interesting. It's interesting to know how it would show in a large groups, though not in just individuals. Large groups also regress. Activities such as rallying around the leader, exhibiting flags, attempting to purify the group from those whose names or skin colors suggest that they may be affiliated with the enemy, and dividing the world into clashing civilizations may be related to concepts such as patriotism and national security. Okay, but they are also aspects of large group regression, as I will illustrate. Thus, a group's realistic efforts to feel secure merge with expressions of human nature under stress, and in certain areas, reality and fantasy become blurred. Regression itself is not good or bad. It's a human condition that appears in individuals and large groups. But regression in large groups is subject to manipulation by political leaders. Okay, I guess we see that a lot. I hope to find some things similar in the real world explained in this book. The relationship between a political leader and his or her followers is rather like a busy street. In normal times, the traffic, information, and political decision-making, as well as other means of influence, flows smoothly in both directions between the leader's influence and the public's awareness. Okay, one more time. The relationship between a political leader and his or her followers is rather like a busy street. In normal times, the traffic, information, and political decision-making, as well as other means of influences, flows smoothly in both directions between the leader's influence and the public's awareness. Okay. Naturally, the flow is something greater in one direction and sometimes in the other, as at rush hour on a busy highway. At other times, however, for one reason or another, the street is officially declared one way, from leader to public. This is seen in the political propaganda of totalitarian regimes. Even in democratic countries, during times of crisis and terror, there is more focus on the traffic traveling from the leader, government, to the public, since the public seeks a savior to protect them and their personal and large group identities. Okay, I guess we are seeing it now in some countries. Leaders and governments can exaggerate people's need to have enemies and allies. Okay? Some leaders may help people differentiate where the reality of threat ends and where the fantasy of threat begins. This lessens anxiety. Other leaders, due not only to what is called national interests, but also to their own personality characteristics, may magnify the dangers, increase anxiety, and help the group to remain in regression, which itself will have further societal and political consequences. In times of crisis and terror, leaders can heal or poison their followers. Okay? Large groups regression disturbs what the late psychoanalyst Erik Erikson called basic trust, a concept that describes how a child learns to feel comfortable putting his or her own safety in a caretaker's hands. By developing basic trust, a child discovers in turn how to trust him or herself in normal circumstances. In normal circumstances, adults also depend on trusting themselves and others to remain functioning citizens. Without basic trust, for example, I would not be able to board an airplane without extreme anxiety because I could not feel comfortable putting my life in the hands of the designers, builders, and pilots of the plane. Basic trust is so fundamental that those who have functional basic trust are not even aware of using it. Once the basic trust of members of a group is shaken, it gets perverted and is replaced by a blind trust. In such a societal regression, we tend to follow leaders' views and directions, whether they are reparative or destructive. Before proceeding, I must add that large groups, as I describe them here, do not speak with one voice. They include subgroups, and each subgroup is composed of individuals with varying patterns of thinking and feeling. However, when I write of large group processes, I am referring to general observable patterns of thinking and feeling that to a great extent are shared by the group. For example, when I refer to a large group that is composed of followers of a particular ideology, I do not focus on dissenters, however interesting their psychology may be. Also, as I will demonstrate, the more a large group is under stress, the more individual differences in thinking and feeling disappear in response to the trauma. Okay, so when the group is traumatized, we become the same. We stop thinking. The aim of this book is to illustrate how manipulation of large group regression and its accompanying large group rituals in the service of maintaining, protecting, and repairing identity may create an atmosphere ripe of unspeakable, seemingly inhumane acts of violence. The examination of large group psychology and leader-follower relations gives us a broader view of what goes on in an international relations above and beyond the usual economic, legal, military, and other real-world issues that are commonly considered to be explanations for such violence. After September 11, the leadership and the media in the United States primarily focused on local interests and referred to others in terms of identified enemies or allies, dividing the world into us and them. A look at human nature, whether we like it or not, connects all humans. Without lowering our guard against realistic security threats, this kind of global approach, I believe, may serve civilization better than fueling the idea of a clash of civilizations, which in fact helps to bring it to reality. Newly graduated from the University of Ankara Medical School in Turkey, I immigrated to the United States in the mid-1950s and trained as a psychiatrist at the University of North Carolina. But I never wanted to open an office and plunge into private practice. So I followed in the footsteps of my parents and two older sisters and their husbands, all of whom were teachers. I became a professor. Since the early 1960s, I have held a post at the University of Virginia School of Medicine as an emeritus professor since the fall of 2002, working beneath the shadow of Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence and the university's founder. I graduated from the Washington Psychoanalytic Institute in 1970 and had been involved in clinical work and teaching for 10 years when an event that would be decisive in my professional life occurred half a world away from me. Thought at first I was not aware of its significance. In 1977, then President of Egypt Anwar Sadat made a historical visit to Israel. Addressing the Knesset, Israeli parliament, he declared that 70% of the problems between Arabs and Israelis are psychological. Subsequently, the American Psychiatrist Association, APA, Committee on Foreign Affairs developed plans to explore Sadat's suggestion to investigate the psychological aspects of Arab-Israeli relationships and to examine how certain ethnic sentiments create resistance to peaceful resolution of conflict between opposing parties. Between 1980 and 1986, I was involved in a series of unofficial Egyptian-Israeli dialogues. During the last 3 years of these dialogues, Palestinians were also present as a member of the APA committee. During this period, the focus of my research slowly began to shift away from understanding the individual's internal world, though I continued to see individual patients up until 1998. Large group psychology and manipulation of mass movements have been my main object of investigation over the last 2 decades. Okay, this is interesting. I quickly realized that my own training as a physician and psychoanalyst would be insufficient for the task of fully understanding the psychology of large groups and the relationship between leaders and followers. I needed help from diplomats, political scientists, historians, and others, and I needed to develop sufficient knowledge of their disciplines, traditions, and methodologies. In 1987, under the auspices of the University of Virginia School of Medicine, I organized the Center for the Study of Mind and Human Interaction, CSMHI, to advance this confluence of disciplines, an institution unique as far as I know in medical school circles, as CSMHI counts psychoanalysts, psychiatrists and psychologists, as well as political scientists, historians, and former diplomats among its faculty. Collectively and separately, the faculty of CSMHI have worked in many areas of the world where ethnic, racial, religious, or other large group tensions and violence have existed or currently exist, from South Ossetia, a region within the legal boundaries of the Republic of Georgia that fought a bloody war with the Georgian government after declaring its independence in the early 1990s, to the predominantly African American community of Blackwell in Richmond, Virginia, where illegal drugs, murder, and dysfunctional family conditions are common. Thus, Anwar Sadat, whom I never met, changed the course of my career. Gradually, I left the traditional psychoanalyst post behind a couch and began to participate unofficially, of course, in negotiating table activities between opposing or enemy groups such as Arabs and Israelis, Russians and Estonians, Turks and Greeks, and Georgians and South Ossetians. As might be expected, my journey from the safety of my clinical office to the uncertainty of a traumatized societies and the heat of intense negotiation was full of resistance. Taking a trip with a patient into his or her internal world from the psychoanalyst's usual seat behind the therapeutic couch is one thing. Sitting down between opposing or enemy representatives, hurling acutely aggressive sentiments at one another, or standing among massively traumatized persons in situations of real and imminent danger is quite another. A psychoanalyst in his or her office is something of a lonely figure. He or she alone, though with the analysis input, of course, assesses the patient's internal conflict and adaptations and decides what to interpret and how to react. But being the boss of a situation as a psychoanalyst can also be a narcissistically gratifying experience. Good training in a reputable institution vaccinates against potential misuse of that position of control by solidifying the analyst's personal and professional integrity and knowledge of him or herself. It's for this reason that in accepted schools of psychoanalysis, the future psychoanalysts must themselves undergo analysis with a senior colleague as part of their training. But as soon as I began my involvement in international, interethnic and other large group processes, I was no longer in control of the situation before me. In a sea of complicated conflicts, it was often difficult simply to sort out unfolding events, let alone to figure out what hidden shared psychological processes were attached to them. Furthermore, I was at times rubbing elbows with world leaders and other major public figures, among them Mikhail Gorbachev, Jimmy Carter, Yasser Arafat, and Desmond Tutu. It was essential for me to work through the emotions and perceptions that associating, even if briefly, with such celebrities induced in me. How could I stay neutral? How could I tame my own prejudices? I had a great deal of internal work to do to adjust to my new career. When it comes to ethnic, national, religious, or ideological sentiments, psychoanalysts, like diplomats and anyone else, may exhibit prejudices and respond to manipulations by political leaders. One's training analysis, unless the psychoanalyst to be suffers from malevolent in the hands of malignant fate, cancerous, non-benign, metastatic. From malignant prejudices and or paranoia, in which case these issues are brought up on the couch, usually doesn't deal with large group sentiments effectively. Sigmund Freud himself, perhaps without even being aware of it, had assimilated a degree of European ethnocentrism and a tendency to stereotype and denigrate other cultures. In his correspondence with Albert Einstein, Freud made certain racist remarks about Turks and Mongols. He also jokingly referred to his patients as Negroes. These were not necessarily vicious or hateful attacks, and racism in general was prevalent and to a degree accepted in late 19th and early 20th century Europe. Freud may have identified with the aggressor in an attempt to defend against mounting anti-Semitism but his remarks nevertheless should serve to remind psychoanalysts that our own personal analysis, self-analysis, and extensive study of and training in human nature do not easily free us from investment in certain cultural norms, the attitudes of our own large group, or even racism. A psychoanalyst working in ethnic, national, or other large groups problems must gain first-hand experience with many cultures and must work through as much as possible his or her own prejudices. Okay, understandable. I long ago concluded that just as I would not take into analysis a friend or family member, I would not become the key figure involved in an unofficial diplomatic project to which my own original large group was a party in conflict. Okay, fair. As a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, I had done my share of work with small therapy groups and had long been familiar with the psychodynamics typical of such groups. As my focus shifted away from traditional clinical work, I observed that most psychoanalysts and other mental health professionals often erroneously apply their knowledge of small therapy groups or organizations of a few hundred members to the psychodynamics of large ethno-national, religious, or ideological groups comprising hundreds of thousands or even millions of members. I became convinced that the psychology of large groups needed to be understood as a distinct dynamic in its own right. Since large groups are made up of individuals, individual psychology would obviously be reflected as a shared phenomenon in large group psychology. Nevertheless, I came to note that large group psychology, once initiated, assumes a life of its own. For example, we know how an individual mourns after the death of a loved one, how his or her psychological wound will heal, and what kinds of conditions may infect the psychological wound. After massive disasters, large groups also mourn losses. A large group's mourning process, however, takes a course that is not necessarily analogous to that of individual mourning, and may affect societal and political movements that on the surface seem to have no connection with the individual member's shared emotional state, past or present. Okay, interesting. The course of my career was influenced by several significant obstacles to collaboration between psychoanalysis and official diplomacy. Some of these obstacles come from within the psychoanalytic discipline itself, whereas others come from the realm of a political science and diplomacy, and still others emerge when these two distant cousins actually try to collaborate. Even when psychoanalysts have turned their attention to large group processes and leader-follower relationships, ideas theoretically valid and meaningful, two psychoanalysts have had only a very limited impact on political theory, and diplomats have found them substantially inapplicable to their practical analysis of international events, decision-making, and propaganda. The primary reason for this limited impact is that most psychoanalytic theories of large group dynamic focus on the individual's perception and experiences of his or her own large group and its leaders. For example, a large group represents an idealized mother, or the leader represents a father figure for the individual group member. Okay. In general, the psychology of particular large groups themselves and the nature of relationships between large groups have not been systematically studied in their own right. The result has been a rather generic sort of theoretical understanding of what a large group and its leaders mean to individual members of that group. By contrast, my work has sought to explain the behavior of specific groups and the psychological components of particular historical situations. Okay. This book relies heavily on my general observations in the international field since 1979. I had two principal laboratories. First, when we brought together influential representatives of enemy groups for a series of dialogues, often lasting several years. These participants evolved as spokespersons of their respective large groups. Again and again, they verbalized the sentiments, feelings, and thoughts shared within their respective groups. Thus, I could collect repeated themes that illustrated how large groups relate to one another. Second, as a member of CSMHI, I have visited many locations from Kuwait to South Ossetia where post-war conditions had made inhabitants keenly interested in their own shared traumatized conditions and their shared perception of their enemies. In such locations, we often carried out hundreds of in-depth interviews with men and women, adults and children from all levels of society. Thus, through these interviews, I once more examined repeated themes in order to understand human nature and the psychological workings of specific large groups. Furthermore, as I stated earlier, I became to know how many political leaders and observed their way of behaving towards their followers. I have divided this book into 4 parts. In part 1, I begin with a description of a large group identity. The chapters that follow this first one deal with large group progression and large group rituals. Part 2 examines the nature of extreme fundamentalist religious groups that preoccupy us so much that the present time. Part 3 focuses on political leader follower relations and how leaders can be destructive or reparative, and how they tame or inflame large group processes. In part 4, I examine in detail the consequences of entrenched societal regression years after the leader and the conditions of he or she created no longer exist. I hope that the reader will find new ways of conceptualizing large group psychology and leader-follower interactions. These general findings, I believe, can be used as a foundation for further study from a different angle of terror and terrorism, including the most recent events. Okay, this is very interesting. We will continue reading. So that was the introduction, right? Part 1, large group psychology.